How's it going, everybody? What I'm doing today is going to do a quick training for you guys because the other day I posted my profit and loss statement on the group, and everyone was like, "Andrew, how do you have 25% profit margins? Like what is that? How do you even do that? Like, are you working 100 hours a week?" And so I had a whole bunch of people message me, and they said, "Andrew, that's not possible in a restaurant." So I just want to explain how exactly that is possible. So I'm just going to walk you through a few things. So when I'm looking at the finances of a business, here are the things that I look at. Okay, I'm going to draw an awesome triangle, and you guys know my drawing is awesome, so I'm going to apologize in advance. But there's three main components I look at for a restaurant. Number one is I look at food cost. Okay, look at labor cost and your rent or occupancy cost. Now, here's what we need to know. For food and labor, depending on your concept, that's going to vary. So in some concepts, like my labor is 20 to 25%, and my food is generally 30, 32%. That's normally where those will end up. Now, having said that, a full service, like I know some places have 20% food cost, but then 35% labor. Or there's even one restaurant that I looked at the numbers and they had 50% labor cost, which is obviously crazy. So what I like to let everybody know is that your prime cost, which is your food and your labor together, what you're aiming for there is 60% or below. Okay, so that means if you are above that, you are basically what I call the dead zone. Okay. Now, the reason is because the more your variable costs go up, your food and your labor costs, the more those go up, that means the less money you have to actually pay your fixed expenses, which don't go anywhere. It just makes it so much harder for you to make a profit as a restaurant. So if you're sitting there and your labor is 30 and then your food is 35, you're at 65. So I mean, it's not terrible, but it's definitely up there. My target is normally to be in the 50 to 55% range. That's where I want people to be. That's where your optimum profits are as a restaurant. Okay. Now, once we've looked at our food and labor, the other things that we are looking for is your rent. So normally we see rent percentages anywhere between 8 and 12%. This is pretty normal. Obviously, the lower you can go, the better. And anytime you're over 12%, obviously that is a really, really high thing. Now, we have to understand is that when your rent is higher, there's nothing you can do about it. You can very rarely go to your landlord and say, "Hey, landlord, let me pay less," because they're not like that. And you've probably noticed that in COVID too, some landlords. But anyhow, the point is here, when you have a rent percentage that is too high, the only option you really have is then to raise your revenues so that your fixed expenses become smaller in proportion. So hopefully that makes sense. So I want you guys to focus on this at the main components that I look at. And now let's talk about how it actually works on a regular basis here. So the way that I like to showcase this, and I'm going to try and make this explanation work as best I can. But normally I'm going to use my own example. So I'm going to use one of my restaurants. We have about 15,000 per month in fixed expenses, which is our rent, our occupancy cost, our franchise fees, our hydro, our phone lines, all that kind of stuff, right? So 15K is our basic expenses. So that means, just for the sake of this example, if our variable was 50%, our food and labor was 50%. That means 30K is where our break-even point would be. Okay, so this is our break-even point here. Now, what we know is that revenue, if it trends up, here's the thing we have to understand from a cost perspective. So basically our break-even point, like I said, is at 30K. All right, so that means everything that is under that, like this, is all negative. So if your break even's 30 and you do 20, that means you're in the hole. If you do 32,000, that means you should show a profit, theoretically, right? That's what we have to know. So what people need to understand is that your expenses actually look a little bit different. So your expenses what they do is they start here, your fixed expenses, and they go up, but they actually go up kind of like this. All right. And then they kind of taper off and they don't grow as much. So most people don't get this. So your expenses start off at 15. So if you were not to open on the morning of the first, you would still have to owe about 15,000 for that month, even if you didn't sell a thing. So that's where your expenses start. And then basically they trend up with your variable costs. And then once you get to the break-even point of 30, which is again right here, that should all be the same. But then what happens after that is all of a sudden you don't have to pay your fixed expenses anymore. After that, for every dollar you bring in revenue, 50% of that is profit. And this is what a lot of people don't understand, is that with your variable costs, if they're 50%, that means half of what you bring in. If your variable costs were 60%, what that means is then 40% is profit once you hit that point. If they're 75%, that means 25% is profit. So what that actually means is all of this stuff here is your profit. And obviously your profit gets bigger as we go. As your revenue trends up, your profits grow all the way along here. So this is what you want. So another way that I can explain this, so let me just do a little grid here. Is probably the easiest way to explain it. All right, there we go. I'm just going to flip this around so we can see it a little bit differently. Hopefully this works out in the video, but I did some math on this, right? And the two examples I'm using here are if you had 50% variable and 75% variable, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to do our 50% variable and our 75% variable. And over here, we're going to do some revenue. So we know that 30K was our break-even point at 50%, right? So that's 30K, then let's do 40K, and then let's do 50K and 60, and then we'll just jump to 80 and 100. Okay, perfect. So what we need to understand here is we need to know what our profits would be based on that. So we know that at 50% variable at 30K, if our expenses fixed were 15, we would make zero profit. Okay, so we know that. So we want to have that as an even point. So now let's instead look at if our variable was 75%, what that would look like. So at 30,000, we would actually be negative 7.5 thousand, right? Just because we only have 25% of each dollar to actually devote towards our fixed costs. So most people don't get this. And, you might not have 75% variable costs, you might have 60% or 65%. But the point you need to understand is that the more your food and your labor costs are up there, the more impactful it is on the long term, unless you have really, really high sales, which we're going to cover in a minute, right? So now say you worked really hard, spent lots of money on advertising and brought your sales up to 40K. So that is literally like that's a 33% increase in sales from 30 to 40. But if your variable is still 75%, that means your bottom line is still minus 5,000. It's only changed by 2,500 because again, 25% of 10,000, it's 2,500. So next is 50,000. So then you would make minus 2.5 thousand. And so realistically, if your variable costs were 75% instead of 50, it would take you all the way to 60,000. You would have to have double the sales to get the same result. Okay. And then on 80K, we would make 5K, and then you would make 10K off of 100,000. And that again is only a 10% profit margin. So don't recommend it. Now let's look at if your variable costs were 50% or closer to it. At 40K, you would actually make that 5,000. At 50K, you would be able to double your profits at 10K. Now, 60,000, you would be making 15. At 80, you would be making 25. And then if you did 100,000 in sales, that would be 35K in profits, which is a 35% profit margin. So the real magic of this is once you control your variable costs, driving your revenue as high as possible through that one location will be what really makes your profit go up. And so most of us, to be honest, we are stuck usually like in this range here. This is where we're stuck. Maybe you make 5K. I mean, some of us are probably not making anything at all, but this is kind of where we stay. But once we get our costs in line, then we drive our revenue. This is where the money really is. This is where we want to go, right? So that's what I just want to share for everybody is we want to get there. We need to drive a revenue, but we need to make sure our costs are controlled first before we do that. And then there's a lot of other steps we need to do to make sure we can drive the revenue. But I hope this is impactful because when this happened for me, when I understood that the real key is driving your top line sales and controlling your bottom costs, once I understood that, business made a lot more sense to me. And all of a sudden, the difference between 60 and 80K, realistically, that's where the money really started to kick in. That's where it really started to make sense using this example. So your concept might be different, totally get it. But what I also want to share is before you even focus on spending any money, make sure your variables are tight, make sure you're not overspending, and make sure you are ready to support all of those customers that come in to make sure they keep on coming back. So if you would like me to take a look at your numbers, I'd be more than happy to do that. Let me know and I will take a peek at your numbers and go through it and see if there's any big holes or things that you might have missed. And really this will tell you a direction on where to go. So going back to my other note here with a little triangle, realistically, if you notice that your food and your labor costs are 60% or above, that is where you should focus. If they're below that, good. You can now move to marketing. And once you do that, then what your goal is to focus on bringing up your revenue here so that as you raise your revenue and your rent stays the same, that cost will shrink from 12 to 8 to 6 to 4, etc. And all of a sudden that differential there, that's all profit. And that's how the game is played for restaurants. So hopefully this is helpful for you. Let me know if you have any questions. And again, I'm happy to take a look at any of your finances to kind of see where some of those holes might be and see how we can help. All right, guys, have a good one. And hopefully your profit after this will be much better than it is now. Bye.